Okay, we're going to get going here. All right, so environmental responsibility today. Establish and monitor programs for sustainability and environmental responsibility. So here's your environmental rule of thumb. If you're not willing to put it in your own backyard, you probably should not insist on putting it in someone else's. Environmental laws and regulations. 3 key federal law areas exist: air pollution, water pollution, and solid and toxic waste disposal. So U.S. laws came out of the 1970s for the most part after Cleveland River caught on fire and Love Canal disasters and other stuff like that in the 60s. So Clean Air Act from 1970, amended as late as 1990. Clean Water Act from 1972. So it was amended to include oil pollution and safe drinking water. And the Toxic Substances Control Act, 1976, amended as late as 1988. This is the solid waste stuff. So the RCRA from 1976, so the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, focuses on generation, movement, storage, transport, and disposal of hazardous waste. This is the cradle to grave law. So it focuses on controlling the ongoing and future management of waste streams. Doesn't do anything about past. So they put that in 1976, and then they figured out, wow, this law does not handle the sites that we've already messed up, like Hanford nuclear waste site. So then they created the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, otherwise known as CERCLA, or the Superfund Act more commonly. That was in 1980. Addresses the problem of remediating hazardous waste sites like Hanford. Interesting enough, Hanford was one of the sites that they made the plutonium for the World War II atomic bombs. And back in the day, they just kind of dumped stuff out the back door and dumped it into these cisterns that are in the ground. And when they started leaking to the groundwater and everything else, it was just bad news. So this was the law that created superfunds and the federal cleanup of these sites. Gives the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, authority to regulate hazardous waste sites and recover costs from responsible companies. All organizations in the creation, distribution, and use of toxic chemicals are responsible for the cleanup. So if you generate it, you're responsible for the cleanup. Doesn't matter how many times you've sold it. Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, otherwise known as SARA, of 1986, reauthorized CERCLA to continue cleanup activities around the country. And Title III of SARA also authorized Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. What's in your backyard? Then we've got the Hazardous Material Transport Act of 1975. Was there a train wreck in Ohio just a while ago where they spilled toxic waste all over the place? Provides adequate protection against the risks of life and property inherent in transportation of hazardous material. Well, generally does, not always. And Secretary of Transportation is the enforcement authority. Hazardous material is any particular quantity or form of a material that may pose an unreasonable risk to health and safety or property. Violations carry both civil and criminal penalties for both the organizations and the managers. So the corporate umbrella does not protect managers against prosecution. And managers are responsible for their employees' behavior no matter what. So the manager can go to jail for their employees' behavior. So each U.S. state has its own version of the EPA, called state EPAs. And the federal laws are enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is the one that's going to take you to court. Other countries' laws, Europe, they've got something called the WEEE, waste from electrical and electronic equipment. Directive, it's about recycling. It makes producers responsible for financing and elimination of hazardous waste. So the thing to remember about the WE law is the liability for the waste that you created is perpetual and will never end. And then there's the ROHS, Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive, and the EU restricts the use of 6 hazardous materials in the manufacture of various types of electronic and electrical equipment. So it's linked to the WEE, and it's part of a legislative initiative to solve the problem of toxic electronic waste, or e-waste. Japan has a law for the promotion of the effective utilization of resources modeled after the European ROHS. And China has the Administration on the Control of Pollution Caused by Electronic Information Projects. It's also modeled on the ROHS. Supply chain potential responsibilities under RCRA and CERCLA. At source, the liability never stops for those who generate a toxic substance known as cradle-to-grave responsibility. Cradle-to-cradle, on the other hand, is all material inputs and outputs end up as technical or biological nutrients. So they're reused in cradle to cradle. Technical nutrients can be recycled, and biological nutrients can be composted. So that's cradle to cradle. In transit, must ensure that transit method is appropriate for toxic goods. So you have a manifest of the movement with a multiple copy developed by DOT and the EPA to ensure that toxic goods are delivered from generator to destination. And the destination buyer of the toxic goods is required to notify the generator when the goods have arrived. And you have to mark that down on the form. At destination, the generator must ensure that the method for disposing of a toxic good meets EPA standards. You can't just say you sold it to this guy. It won't work. Toxic spills carry cleanup responsibility and liability for those with any relation to the toxins, including purchaser, seller, generator, all those guys. You're all going to end up paying for it. And you can't really get away from that liability. Emission, release, and or disposal into air, water, and onto land is illegal unless the EPA has issued you a permit. So at disposal, the EPA has developed a set of mandatory technology-based treatment standards that must be met before hazardous waste is placed in a landfill. Automotive sector regulatory information is here. And then the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board we looked at before. They've got some information too. So here's stuff on automotive sector from the EPA. And then we've got standards from the accountability standards boards on road transportation. And then here's PACCAR's standards report right here, this one, which covers a lot of stuff. It's the SASB report, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board. And then you've got values and policies for each organization. So ISO 14001 is the environmental management system. It's the company's statement of values and policies. So the statement should include things like compliance with all environmental laws, prevention of harm, dedication to the preservation of the environment, commitment to meeting goals and targets, a commitment to be measuring results and performance, in addition to making changes necessary to meet goals. Delivery methods for the sustainability environmental message, internal competition, supporting initiatives by individual employees, etc. Signal sustainability is a priority for the organization from senior management, communicate effectively, manage talent, reinforce the message. And then purchase recycled materials. In addition to implementing their own internal programs for reuse, companies can also include as part of their EMS a goal of purchasing recycled materials. Companies may require supplier certification of recycled materials and selections of suppliers that employ solar, wind, and other renewable resources. So risk transfer. Under RCRA and CERCLA, generators of toxic substances are responsible for the conduct of the suppliers hired to dispose of or transport substances. No matter what the contract says, they're going to come back to the generator because they usually have the deepest pockets. What was once a legal method of disposal may not remain legal in the future, and generators and users may still be liable for the cleanup. So make sure you know how you're disposing of it, and don't try to skirt the rules. Contractual disclaimer clauses may be useful and recover some costs from the supply base, but they do not relieve the generator of liability. You can't get rid of the liability if you're a generator. And the generator continues to be the owner of the toxic material till the grave, cradle to grave. If the parent organization is deemed to have sufficient control over the subsidiary, then the parent is still liable for the cleanup. Contractual transfer of risk can also be done through freight terms, Incoterms. So if you use freight terms like delivered at terminal, delivered at place, delivered duty paid, there'll be some limits. You won't, as far as your liability, you won't get rid of all of it, but you can get rid of some of it. PACCAR Environmental Procedures, paragraph 7, addresses this in our supplemental T's and C's. And insurance, we can use some insurance to provide coverage. It'll provide partial coverage, but generally indemnity and premises liability coverage usually excludes any environmental damages. The waste generator could require the supplier to carry insurance indemnification policies, but must state that the environmental issues are covered. And the EPA can mandate a cleanup that collects costs from the generator organization and leave them to collect from the suppliers. So they just make the generator pay for it. If the suppliers are involved, the generator has to get it from them. And PACCAR has a specific disposal services contract which covers insurance. So legal, because of the public policy behind cleanup laws, there's little case law supporting release of a party from liability. Just doesn't happen. And there are no legal guarantees that a generating organization will escape environmental cleanup liability. And they don't care if it drives you to go broke. They're gonna pay. So certifications is the ISO 14000 family of standards. 14001, 2015. Criteria for the environmental management system. It maps out a framework for the company and organization to follow. 1404 provides guidance from the organization on establishment, maintenance, improvement of the environmental management system. 1405 is for small and medium-sized enterprises. 1406 can be used by those organizations that implemented an environmental management system, but can help in integrating eco design into their manufacturing. So cradle to cradle kind of designs. 1464, principles and requirements of the organization for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas. And 26,000 provides guidance on how organizations can operate in a socially responsible way, acting in an ethical and transparent way that contributes to the health and welfare of society. ISO standards require ongoing internal audits and external audits, 6 to 9 months, and corrective action processes is also needed to meet compliance. So speaking of audits, ISO audits, they're used to determine if the system in place works. So internal audits performed by the company employees with no stake in the outcome is an ISO requirement. That's the internal audit done by the internal audit department. Self-inspections, another form of internal audit, but That's the supply management function inspecting their own processes. That's not a requirement from ISO. External audits usually performed by ISO auditors or the EPA. Supply chain, when auditing the supply chain, what standard to use is an issue. Some standards are company policies, contract requirements, regulatory requirements, ISO requirements. You have to be clear with your supply chain what you want them audit them to. Questions to be asked, who will see the results, what will be done with the results, who will be permitted to make changes based on the audit results, and what will be done with the audit report. Companies become very concerned with this stuff. So self-audits followed by voluntary disclosures to the government regulators along with self-correction serve to reduce penalties against the company. But the worst position a company can be in is repeating an ongoing violation. Minimization of waste. So reduce energy, materials, and waste. It's a very simple strategy. And you can reuse materials and objects either for their original or new purposes. That doesn't mean you don't have to deconstruct it. And you can recycle, which is reclaiming materials from used products and then reusing them in the manufacture of new products. And the cradle-to-cradle design. So products are designed to break down into technical and biological nutrients. And the zero waste concept. So all discarded materials are designed to become resources for others to use. And it eliminates all discharges to land, water, or air that may be harmful. That's the zero waste concept. Disposal considerations. There's options. There's prior to end of life cycle purchasing should be seeking disposal options for waste. And they got to be legal. Other uses for waste and byproducts, sell them for use to another organization. Use the waste and byproducts elsewhere in the organization. Use scrap brokers. Dispose of materials by some legal means. Destroy the waste or byproducts and turn the waste back into usable nutrients. All right, some questions here. The concept of creating production techniques that are not just efficient, but are also essentially waste-free is called what? Production techniques that are not just efficient, but are essentially waste-free. Well, it's not going to be C or D. I'm going to guess it's going to be B, I'm thinking. B it is, because cradle-to-cradle production classifies all material inputs and outputs as either technical or biological nutrients. Okay. And an organization supply manager recently attended a new seminar on environmentally preferred purchasing, EPP. It sees the need and value for his organization to support and embrace the aspect of minimization of waste and associated hazards for materials. However, the organization is very focused on the bottom line and cost containment. Which of the methods listed below should the supply manager suggest implementing first to senior management? Reduce the quantity of these items used, reuse the existing products where able, recycle the products within the company, and renovate the structure to be more environmentally friendly. Well, that's not D, even though that's the longest answer. Reuse could be reduce, more likely, and recycle, less likely. I'd go with A. A it is. The ability to reduce the quantity of hazardous materials coming into the company will reduce the generation of waste. All right, there's 10 questions out there. Go ahead and get started on them. And raise your hand when you get done. I don't want F6. I want F3. Okay. Answers. Okay, number one is option Charlie. Recycling is the process of reclaiming materials from used products and using them in manufacturing new products. Two is also Charlie's. There's no evidence to suggest the supplier is attempting to confuse the supply professional about environmental issues. Three is also Charlie because the SDS is provided by the supplier under the U.S. OSHA regulations, part of the cradle to grave documentation of toxic goods. Four is also Charlie, very popular answer, because the RCRA is a U.S. federal law passed in '76, which focuses on the management of hazardous waste. Five is Bravo, because CERCLA is a U.S. federal law that, with the Superfund law, gives the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to regulate hazardous waste sites. Six is also Bravo. It's making the byproduct something the GHI can sell on the market will bring the highest return for the byproduct and eliminate expensive disposal costs. Seven is also Bravo. Right, because 45 days is the correct amount of time required for notification to the supply manager. So if you go after 45 days, you have to go start looking for what happened to the stuff. 8 is Alpha, because the CERCLA provides for the cleanup of the remediation of closed and abandoned hazardous waste sites. 9 is Charlie. Federal Resource Conservation Act, or RCRA, states that the record-keeping system helps to track life cycle of hazardous waste and seeks to reduce the amount of hazardous waste being illegally disposed of. And 10 is Delta, because the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for implementing and enforcing federal laws to clean the air and water. All right. F4 tomorrow.